Barack Obama meets Gulf leaders in Saudi Arabia to discuss the state of the Middle East. The wars in Syria and Yemen and the fight against jihadists were all on the agenda, as was Iran. But one question looms larger than every other. Are America and Saudi Arabia still friends? For 70 years, they've been allies. Riyadh sold oil, Washington provided security. But yesterday, when the U.S. president landed in Saudi, King Salman was conspicuously absent from the welcome party, as you see right now. My guests this evening, Reza Marashi joins us from Washington, D.C. You're a research director at the National Iranian American Council. Of course, Iran plays a major part in this debate and in the rift between Washington and Riyadh, so we'll hear from you in just a moment. I'm also joined by Tony Badran, a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He joins us from New York City. In fact, Tony, I want to start the debate with you this evening. In your mind, are Washington and Riyadh still allies right now?
Yes, but it's very obvious that the Obama administration is not very enthusiastic about this alliance and has, by the word of the president himself, has been looking to reshape America's posture in the region. And it's not about just Saudi Arabia, mind you, it's about other U.S. allies, and in fact, the whole alliance system of the United States, which includes Israel, Turkey, and the Saudis and Jordan and so on. And the president has been very public about this, including most recently in his interview with the Atlantic magazine, about how he doesn't see that the traditional American policy that has been in place for the last 70 years is workable, and that he thinks that his policy, which is to sort of pivot away from these allies and make an opening towards Iran, is a better policy. Obviously, the allies in the Middle East and around the world strongly disagree, but this is the result of this particular president's vision, which breaks with traditional American policy in the Gulf.
Reza Marashi, I'd like to hear you on the same question. Do you think Washington and Riyadh are still allied in the way that they have been over the last 70 years?
Well, I would call them partners because they haven't entered into a formal alliance structure the same way we have with, say, Turkey, who's a NATO ally. We actually don't have an alliance structure with any country in the Middle East. That's not unique to Saudi Arabia, Israel, or anyone else. But we remain partners with Saudi Arabia, and that's not going to change anytime in the foreseeable future. If anything, the terms of the relationship are being mutually renegotiated. I think the Atlantic article that was raised by my colleague certainly outlined President Obama's vision, but I wouldn't call it only President Obama's vision. I think prior to Bill Clinton's presidency in 1992, the United States did a relatively effective job having balance of power politics in the Middle East, where we had friends and we had rivals, and if our friends weren't willing to do business with us to achieve American interests, then we could do either tactical or strategic collaboration with our rivals. Again, prioritizing American interests above all else. So at the end of the day, I think we need to right-size our expectations both of what President Obama is trying to do, because it's not revolutionary, and also about what the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia is going to entail.
Reza, let me interrupt you for a second. You're describing this like nothing out of the ordinary is happening, but by the description that's made in several media articles, you know, the Gulf leaders are impatient to see the back of him.
That's true, because we're pivoting away from a policy where they were allowed to have their cake and eat it too. What President Obama is trying to do, and I have a sneaking suspicion whoever succeeds President Obama will continue to try to do, is to ask our partners in the region, be it Saudi Arabia or anyone else, to pull their fair share, to live up to their end of the bargain, and to actually be partners in word and deed. And that's beneficial for everyone, not just the United States.
All right, Tony Badran, I'd like to bring you back into this conversation. What are America's strategic interests in the region, and are they better served by sticking to Saudi Arabia? Both of you have been talking about redefining the terms of this relationship or pivoting away.
Well, let me rephrase. The difference between the vision I'm describing and the one that Reza is describing is that the United States had a position of primacy in the region, which the Saudis very openly embraced and want to continue, whereas with the Iranians, they are very explicitly looking to overturn this order in the Middle East. That's an American order. It's not a Saudi order. It's not one balanced order. It's an American order in the Middle East. Now, the president, part of his opening to Iran is precisely to get the United States, or at least diminish its presence and abandon this order, which he, again, in his own words, saw as wrong and unsustainable and unworkable, or whatever, what have you. The notion that the allies, that there's something not revolutionary happening here, I guess, especially going back to pre-Clinton days, the notion, for example, that Russia would be allowed to set up a military base on NATO's southern flank, that somehow this is, yes, another order of business, or that the American president will come out and says that Iran's equities, which incidentally mean supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon with advanced rockets, should be respected, is clearly not something that any other administration would have countenanced in the way that this administration has.
Well, I guess it's all synthesized by Barack Obama himself when he says in that Atlantic article that both of you have alluded to, he says Saudi and Iran should just share the neighborhood. Tony, do you think that's something that's feasible?
Of course not. But then again, this is not about Saudi and Iran sharing the neighborhood, because Saudi has already been a willing client state and partner of the United States, and willing to acknowledge U.S. primacy there. So it's actually the American neighborhood in that region, which the Iranians wanted to kick out. So the notion that now that these guys have to live with each other presumes that the United States will no longer be the principal actor there. And of course, the way the Iranians, we've seen how the Iranians share the neighborhood. I mean, we've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in Bahrain, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. It's an aggressive revolutionary regime whose vision is to overturn the existing order. And in the past, American policy was to precisely preserve the status quo and deter revolutionary powers, whether it was the Soviet Union and its client, like the Syrians or the Iraqis, and so on.
Tony, let me cut you off for a second. You say that Iran, that we've seen in Yemen and Lebanon, for instance, to name just a few countries, how Iran behaves in the region, and by that, I guess you're meaning supporting proxy rebel groups, Hezbollah or the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Couldn't you make the counter-argument that Saudi Arabia has been equally bellicose in the region?
No, Saudi Arabia, first of all, has no structure that in any way is comparable to the Quds Force, for instance, and the IRGC.
They have they're leading a military coalition in Yemen.
Precisely, a military coalition in Yemen on their border, which was led by a group that is, today, by the way, the president talked about how this group was receiving arms from the Iranians, and that the United States is going to step up its efforts to interdict those weapons.
And the Yemeni government is receiving arms from Saudi Arabia.
Well, the Yemeni government, which was overturned by this group, which was looking to set up basically...
No, but even before then, Saudi Arabia was providing military support for the regime in Yemen.
Excuse me. Of course, in a partnership, there are deals and agreements between states. It was a government that's being helped by another allied government. There was a coup that happened here, essentially, by the Houthis. And the Saudi government intervened on behalf of what it considered the legitimate deposed government to prevent the rise on its borders of a threat of the kind that exists on Israel's border with Hezbollah.
Let's get back to this idea of sharing the neighborhood, which appears to be Barack Obama's ambition for the Middle East. Reza Marashi, do you think that's something that's feasible for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, for both? Do you think Barack Obama can achieve his vision of essentially withdrawing a little bit from the Middle East and letting them work it out?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think the United States is withdrawing. I think we're recalibrating our presence in the Middle East. And when it comes to Iran and Saudi Arabia sharing the region, I absolutely think that they can. I do not think that there is any inherent difference of opinion. That they absolutely can. I do not think that there is any inherent difference of opinion that is cannot be worked out at the negotiating table. As recently as 2004, Iran and Saudi Arabia reached a defense pact with one another that was negotiated on the Iranian side by the current Supreme National Security Council head, Ali Shamkhani, and President Rouhani. Dr. Zarif, the foreign minister, was also part of those negotiations as well. So at the end of the day, you have a precedent. And I'm not telling you that just because it's happened in the past, it can happen again today, because we're in a much more precarious situation in the region today. But what I am telling you,
tensions are currently very high between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Of course they are. Nobody's denying that. But what I'm telling you, and what I agree with President Obama when he says, durable solutions to any conflict, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere, requires the buy-in of every country with the capacity to wreck the solution. If you try and solve any problem in the Middle East at the expense of Iran, at the expense of Saudi Arabia, or other regional powerful countries, the solution is not going to be sustainable, because then it incentivizes whoever's left out of the arrangement to try and destabilize it. So again, I think President Obama is going down the right path, and I think over time, once serious and durable negotiations begin on a variety of issues, whether it's Syria, Yemen, or anything else that might pop up, that's going to be the biggest and most important way to try and resolve conflicts peacefully.
I want to touch on something that you alluded to just a short while ago, Reza. This shift, do you think this comes from Barack Obama, or do you think this responds to American national interests and will carry over to the next president?
In my view, it absolutely accords with what's in the best interest of the United States and its national security and foreign policy. I do think it will transcend whoever ends up succeeding Barack Obama in the White House. And in the bigger scheme of things, a president, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, is only as smart as the advisors that he or she surrounds themselves with. So again, whoever comes next, if it's a Democrat, for example, it'll be largely a very similar cast of characters advising on foreign policy and national security. Obama didn't come up with this on his own as it pertains to an opening to Iran or recalibrating our relations with a variety of countries in the Middle East. Same on the Republican side. They can go back to the policies of George W. Bush, which largely were unsuccessful, or they can try and recalibrate their policies and take a different approach. I think most of these people are wise enough to pursue the latter. So here you have a situation where something that has been fluid since the Iraq War in 2003, a new homeostasis needs to be achieved. And the likelihood of that happening during 8 years of Barack Obama's presidency is extremely low.
Tony Bedran, are we going to see more of the same with the next president, Barack Obama's successor?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, one of the things that Barack Obama has done is to try to lock in as much of his break with the 70-year-old traditional American policy, so that to tie the hands of whoever comes after him, whether it's with the very deeply flawed nuclear deal or with other announcements about, including Iran as a stakeholder in Syria or in Yemen and so on. But the problem, however, with the argument of recalibration is that it really requires one to believe that there is an equivalence between steady allies who want the United States to be the principal actor in the Middle East and a revolutionary regime that openly on a daily basis touts its enmity to the United States and its entire alliance system. So the notion of a recalibration and moving away from your allies and the alliance system that you've built to somehow countenance the interests of an explicit enemy makes absolutely no sense. And I think to that effect, as we're seeing already, whether it's with the U.S. Navy and sailors episode, or with the other belligerent acts of the Iranian government, that this is going to continue, unfortunately, as a result of the kind of policies that the Obama administration pursued, that it's going to embolden them to pursue this in the future. And it's going to require either a response by the states of the region, which we've been seeing because of the absence of the United States. These states are taking matters into their hand, which is not something that necessarily the United States should want, or by a future president who will notice that this is completely untenable and that he or she would need to assert the U.S. primacy and its national interests vis-a-vis Iran as well.
Tony, a major factor I haven't asked you about yet: oil dependence. It has decreased. Washington's oil dependence vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. Does Washington still need Saudi Arabia?
It was never about oil from Saudi Arabia. That's just a facile argument.
That was never a factor?
Not for the United States. The United States is not a major importer of Saudi oil. The Saudi oil has to do with the larger international market, which of course affects the United States because of the world integrated economy. But for instance, China is somebody who's much more looking towards Gulf oil than the United States is. It's about the stability of the world order, stability of security structures that the Obama administration has really tinkered with, as we saw with, I mentioned Russia being on the southern flank of NATO now, the eastern and the Pacific with the Chinese and so on. So the idea of the United States abandoning a structure that it had carefully built in the Middle East for decades, it doesn't just stay in the Middle East, right? It carries to other areas, as we're seeing in Syria and as we're seeing in the Pacific as well. So the same thing happens in the case of oil. It has to do with stability of world prices. It has to do with stability of markets and global economy. So this is not about Saudi Arabia. This is about the global order that the United States had underpinned.
If we just leave the oil aside then for a moment, let me ask you this question. I'm going to go to Reza first before coming back to you, Tony. Let me phrase the question differently. In what way does Washington need Saudi Arabia?
I think that there are a variety of ways. We need their collaboration on counterterrorism, both in pursuit of terrorist individuals and organizations, and in the hope that Saudi Arabia will stop supporting organizations, particularly in Syria, that are on America's list of terrorist organizations.
But that's my point. Barack Obama has been very, he's reported to have been very annoyed by the fact that there's been some funding, some Saudi funds. I'm not talking about government action here, but I am talking about Saudi private funds going to finance radical groups in Syria, or even more generally, the fact that Saudi Arabia has been promoting a very radical brand of Islam, Wahhabism, throughout the region for years.
Well, I share President Obama's frustrations, and I think many Americans share Obama's frustrations as well. But in the bigger scheme of things, just because we have a partner in the Middle East that does things we don't like, it doesn't mean that we should dismantle the diplomatic relationship. Saudi Arabia is a regional power, and in all likelihood, they will continue to be one going forward. So the United States needs to have a strategic relationship with this country. Frankly, I would make the same argument about Iran. At the bigger scheme of things, though, the U.S. and the Saudis are friends. The U.S. and Iran are not friends. But the U.S. and Iran can, if they continue to take steps in a positive direction, potentially shift the relationship from enemies to one of competitors or rivals. Maybe it resembles something that looks like China or Russia. I'm not telling you that that's ideal, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we've seen over the past 37 years. And I think Obama's past year and a half to 2 years of diplomacy with Iran demonstrates that.
So ultimately, it goes back to your argument of he's just recalibrating things, taking a small step backwards, with respect to Saudi Arabia, and a small step forwards with respect to Iran. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, let me phrase it to you this way. If the Saudis, as many in the United States suspect, had some kind of complicity with the 9/11 attacks, was the United States able to hold them accountable? Absolutely not. If Israel continues to take aggressive measures on Palestinian land, which the United States government repeatedly calls into question, do we have measures that we can do to hold the Israelis accountable? No, because we don't have leverage. But if we improve our relations with everyone in the region, if our partners take actions that we don't like, then we have a greater likelihood of having recourse.
All right, Tony Bedran, we have less than a minute left. Go ahead.
This is absurd. First of all, if you go back to the Treasury Department's designations of what al-Qaeda networks operating in Syria, where they were being financed from, actually, Mohsen al-Fadli was based in Iran, and according to the Treasury Department, he had an arrangement with the Iranian government. That's number one. Number two, as for this ridiculous notion about Saudi complicity in 9/11, which, by the way, the White House stoked right before President Obama's visit, it's basically to drive up the opponent's negatives more than, they want to make a case for Iran and they can't really make a good one. Because if anything, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, the state that comes out looking worst in it in terms of its possible complicity is actually the Iranians, not the Saudis.
All right, Tony Bedran, thank you very much. I'd like to thank both our guests, Reza Marashi, Tony Bedran, for joining us on the France 24 debate. Of course, we'll continue to break down this trip by Barack Obama to Saudi Arabia, where he met the 6 members of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. We leave it at that for the moment. We're back in just a moment with more.